I can already start and say, Boris, thank you for the invitation, Avi and Steffen. And I'm very happy that I can speak about my encounters with this man who was actually Gerd. He was born as Gerd. You can see it? Okay. Yes, okay. And as all of you, most of you will know the term from Partners in Conversation, from Testimony or Partners in Conversation is a term which was used most often by Henry Greenspan, and the original term is related to words by survivor historian and literal scientist Ruth Klüger. So the aim of this lecture today is that, I mean, there were many aspects which I learned during these encounters. And if I will start with this now, I will, let's say, end maybe tomorrow. But I will now,
okay.
Who said okay? No, but the thing is that I will, okay, these are only 4 examples that I learned a lot from my historical research on Hachshara and non-Zionist training in Nazi Germany. And I will focus on this aspect today. But I mean, it sounds, I mean, this emotional side is now, meanwhile, an integral part of Holocaust research about emotions. But when we had a lot of discussions, and there was one incident, I will mention it only shortly today, that I understood what it means, what survivor guilt means. I mean, I read a lot about it, but then on this special occasion, it was different. Then I learned, for example, from him what knowing what happened during the Holocaust, for example, to friends, to family, to his sister, to his parents. And this knowing was deeply connected to hope, hoping until today maybe there's someone left, maybe that his sister would knock on the door and return. And of course, I like it always to speak with elderly people and learn from them and their perspective on life. This was very interesting. So, actually, I have to say, when I spoke with him on the phone for the first time in November 2013, this was only via on the phone, I had been to all the important archives which are related to Hachshara. Not all of them, of course, not. But for example, I started with the Federal Archives in Berlin on microfilm, the Reichsvereinigung, Reichsvertretung files by the Jewish organizations in Nazi Germany. I went to the Ghetto Fighters Archives, Yad Vashem, the Brandenburgisches Landeshauptarchiv. There are immigration files, for example, from the trainees. I watched the Shore Foundation interviews, Leo Baeck Institute, had files from the Central Zionist Archives, been to several kibbutz archives, Gal Ed or Hasurea, or I have been to Tefen in the north of Israel. So, and I thought, I don't know everything, but of course, but I'm well informed. And now I would like to tell you how I learned from these encounters many more historical aspects. So, shortly, his story is, no, the thing is that when we spoke on the phone for the first time, he was a very unfriendly and provoking person. And not only that, he asked me, someone mentioned this in the morning, I think, Anne, that the people ask you, why are you doing what you're doing, since when, and for what? But he had the same questions, but absolutely unfriendly. He said, why are you doing? No one's interested. Why do you come? And so on. And I become quite a little bit angry, but not angry that we hang up the phone. But I struggled a little because he was so absolutely unfriendly. And I said, okay, sorry, we don't have to speak about I can call you or we can leave it. But he said, no. But then in this phone call, it changed, because then he started, because he was in Berlin. This is in 1920. He was born there in he was actually born in Bromberg, which is Poland today, but as a small child came to Berlin. And then he's told me this story, and this was so touching, because I mean, sometimes it's strange when you said you feel it, but only by this deep, provoking voice. He told me, you know, when I was a small child, I saw my first Zeppelin on the sky, and I was proud to be a German boy. And he started to sing a little bit the German anthem. Yes? Okay. And so until 2016, let's say 2 or 3 times a year, we spoke on the phone. Always unfriendly like he was, but I didn't care about this because I liked him. So anyway, the first time I met him in September 42, in September 2016 in Haifa. The first thing is that he told me I'm too tall. Because you are too tall. I thought you were small. You are really a big woman. Okay, thank you. Oh, anyway, so I learned more about his specific story. I have to say I was in contact with a teacher near Berlin who was already in contact with him. And I make a long story short. He was born in Bromberg, was raised in Berlin, and of course when Hitler came to power in 1933, he was 13 years old. And as a footnote, he died 2 years ago due to Corona in the, some days before his 100th birthday, and now in June, and now since I'm here, I'm going through his notes and diaries and notebooks and everything. And yes, and then in 1939, I have to say he was never a Zionist. He was German, as he said, nothing. I mean, even in his notes, I found only issues related to Berlin and Christmas. So, but then, of course, we all know the historical events. Then the question of immigration rose and flight. And he became a part of a Hachshara group in Havelberg near Berlin. He went to Neuendorf, and this was a retraining site, which was later on acknowledged by Herr Lutz as a Hachshara. And then from this site, the Gestapo administrated forced labor camps for Jews in the forests of Brandenburg. And this is one picture where he's boxing. He's the guy on the left side. So, yes. Then he was chosen in Schönfelde by his Madrich for illegal, for Aliyah. And then he was one of these people who came on these 3 ships, Milos, Atlantic, and Pacific, to the harbor of Haifa, and he was one of the Patria survivors. Yes. And here, for example, on the left, which I found in his notes, he they are not contemporary, because I found also, of course, his diary was lost in the Mediterranean. But here's every single station from his journey from Germany until his release from Atlit. Because he then finally had to live 1 year in Atlit, because he was one of the, he and I don't know, 20 others, I think, were the last prisoners to be released from Atlit in December 41. I think there was a reason that he was among the last, but okay. And for example, I found a poem here in his documents about the deportation from the people from the from the one ship to Mauritius and so on. So it's really interesting what I found in these notes in the last days. Do you see here? Yes. So when I met him for the first time, he was telling me the well-known story about Hachshara in Nazi Germany. He said, it was a happy time. I was so happy. We were living in the forest. We were living as teenagers. It was everything so nice, and I loved it, and I loved it, and I loved it. But from others, I believed it. From him, not, because something was strange, because he was saying how happy he was, but in the end you had the feeling something is wrong here. However, I made some notes. I had some recordings and so on. So everything was alongside the German Zionist ideological reports, which are also emphasized in, for example, contemporary press clippings from Hechalut's functionaries. But in 2018, and meanwhile we met at least 10 times because we spent our family vacation in Haifa, and I met him quite often. He alternated this narrative, and this was interesting because I didn't ask, but I think against the background of our ongoing conversations. I have to say he alternated his narrative only after we had a big fight, because he accused me of being German, and his grandfather had been to the German army, fought during the First World War, and he became very angry, and I became very angry too, and then after that it was all good again. And then he began to speak about Neuendorf and Schönfelde, and now he came across the thing. Then he started very long and very deeply to speak about all the tensions which appeared, because due to the process of people being chosen for Aliyah, and this was a large issue then in these talks, and I was really astonished because I never heard this story like this. I mean, this every morning for weeks and months we were standing up and we looked at the lists and we asked our madrichim who can leave, who can go, and whatever. And by the way, I had a conversation with 2 Holocaust researchers in December 2018 after he told me this, and they told me, you cannot fight with a Holocaust survivor about his narrative. And I said, yeah, but I mean, it's not my fault, but I have a responsibility, but I mean, how can he accuse me? But anyway, I think he's a provoking person, as all of you know, yes? And maybe he wanted to test me, I don't know, whatever, but after that, our discussions changed. And now I wanted to know more about how people were chosen. This is the example now. I have 5 minutes or so, yes. Then I went, for example, to the Wiener Library in London, and I found medical examination files about Neuendorf and how people were gained access to this site. And yeah, anyway, doesn't matter. So what I found interesting about these files is how people were chosen. They had medical examinations before they could enter. People with mental diseases or kidney diseases, how it's in English, were not allowed. Women with heavy menstruation problems were not allowed to enter. And finally, pregnant women were not allowed. This you can see from the files. This is only 1 page. Okay. Yeah, and now since then I'm digging deeper into this part of how were people chosen, what is their perspective, not from this official narrative which is often presented in historical research, but more on the ordinary, let's say, refugee, the ordinary refugee, who entered Palestine in the end of the 1930s, 1940s. By the way, meanwhile in Berlin, his family was deported to Riga, and most probably were murdered in the forests of Bikaniki or Rumbula. Yes, and at the occasion of our ongoing conversations, there were many, many more aspects, as I mentioned in the beginning. Yes. I went through his notes during the last days, and I come to the end now. In his works from over the last 50 years, Henry Greenspan called for meeting survivors as comrades quote, comrades, partners in the same infinitely wondrous and infinitely terrifying world, end quote. Moreover, he emphasized to see them as human beings with positive and negative sides. I quote him, "We are not used to imagining a Treblinka survivor and a crazy ardent lover as the same person," end quote. This is one of Greenspan's sentences which made me think more. Of course, you always think about the interviews which you conduct with the survivors. I came to the conclusion that we as researchers, interviewers and so on, choose only the axis or the level or the road to which we access survivors. I say this because I met last year in January someone, first time on the phone, a survivor, whom I asked for an interview for another project. And he said, "No, I gave one interview, this is enough, and I don't want to be asked about the Holocaust again. My life," he said, "is so much more," and he said, I quote, "I cannot help it. It was my childhood when it happened. But what happens until today, people ask me about the Holocaust." And I have to say, this man, he was a famous photographer in the GDR. He was a famous filmmaker in the German Federal Republic. But people, and he was a theater, he made theater plays. It's my German English now. But he told me, and then I had this Goethe, I don't know, play, and then the journalists came, and all of them asked me about what happened during your childhood in the Holocaust, and no one asked about his play. And then he looked at me and my colleague, we made this interview, and said, "Please let me know what constitutes a life. Is it only this or much more?" So, yes, I think I have to close now. Only this is, by the way, me and him in 2018, and which I found also interesting. After we were fighting a little bit, he went on the ladder. It was really scary because he was 98, yes, and then he was somewhere there. And then he put this tray out, and he was, for the rest of his life, he was a worker in the harbor of Haifa. And he, after, I don't know when, maybe he doesn't remember, I didn't remember, but this was a tray from the Patria, which he found in the Mediterranean. And now it's lost. We have searched for it some days ago, but we will find it. Okay, this is Bert, and thank you for listening.